In October 2024, the state of Texas came within 2 hours of executing a man for a murder that may never have happened. His name is Robert Roberson. He has been on death row for over 20 years. The crime he was convicted of was killing his 2-year-old daughter by shaking her to death. The diagnosis that sent him there, shaken baby syndrome, has since been challenged by more than 30 of the world's leading medical scientists. The original lead detective who arrested him, a bipartisan group of Texas lawmakers, and one of the best-selling authors in the world. Texas has tried to execute him twice. Twice in the final days, once in the final hours. The execution has been stopped. As of today, Robert Roberson is still on death row. His case is still not resolved. This is the story of how he got there, and why, more than 20 years later, nobody, not even the people fighting hardest for his life, can say for certain how it ends. Robert Roberson was born in 1966 in Wood County, Texas. By his late 20s, he had already spent time in prison. Burglary, theft, parole violations. He was released in 2000. He had 2 children from a previous marriage. And in 1999, a woman he wasn't in a relationship with gave birth to a daughter. DNA testing confirmed Roberson was the father. The mother struggled with addiction. Custody went to the child's grandparents at first, and then, after Roberson proved paternity, to him. Her name was Nikki Curtis. Nikki was not a healthy child. From early in her life, she had chronic medical problems, repeated infections, breathing issues, hospital visits. This detail will matter enormously later in this story. Keep it in mind. On January 31st, 2002, 2-year-old Nikki was unwell. She had a high fever, over 104 degrees, and had already been taken to the hospital twice in the days before. Each time, doctors sent her home with medication. Some of that medication included codeine and a drug called promethazine, drugs that doctors now widely agree should never be given to a child in her condition because they suppress breathing. That night, Roberson says Nikki fell out of bed. He checked on her, comforted her, and put her back to sleep. The next morning, he woke up and found her unconscious. Her lips were blue. She wasn't breathing properly. He rushed her to Palestine Regional Hospital. She was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Here is where this story turns from a tragedy into something far more troubling. At the hospital, a pediatrician examined Nikki's injuries, swelling and bleeding in her brain, and diagnosed shaken baby syndrome. This diagnosis was made before an autopsy had even been performed. The lead detective on the case, a man named Brian Wharton, arrived at the hospital that day. He would later say, in his own words, that he had never received formal training on shaken baby syndrome. He knew about it only vaguely. What Wharton noticed instead was Robert Roberson's reaction, or rather, the lack of one. Roberson did not cry. He did not appear distressed in the way hospital staff and police expected a grieving father to behave. His affect was described as flat, detached. To the people in that hospital that day, this looked like guilt. Robert Roberson has autism spectrum disorder. It would not be formally diagnosed until years after his conviction. In 2002, in that hospital, nobody knew this about him. Not the doctors, not the detectives, not the jury that would later decide his fate. They simply saw a father who didn't grieve the way they expected, and they drew the conclusion that seemed obvious to them at the time. Roberson was arrested the next day. The medical examiner who performed Nikki's autopsy ruled her death a homicide, consistent, she said, with violent shaking and impact trauma. Robert Roberson was charged with capital murder. In Texas, that charge carries one of 2 sentences: life in prison or death. Robert Roberson's trial took place in 2003. The prosecution's case rested almost entirely on the shaken baby syndrome diagnosis. At the time, this diagnosis was treated by the medical and legal community as close to scientific fact. It had been first proposed by a British neurosurgeon in 1971, and by the early 2000s, it had become the default explanation whenever a small child showed certain patterns of bleeding in the brain. Even without any outward sign of injury, there was a problem. Nobody in that courtroom fully grappled with shaken baby syndrome as a diagnosis had never been validated by the kind of rigorous scientific study that other serious medical conclusions require. It was, in a sense, inferred backwards, built from cases where abuse was suspected rather than tested forward from controlled research. Remarkably, Roberson's own trial attorney did not seriously contest the shaken baby diagnosis. Instead, his defense strategy was to argue that Roberson had lost control, essentially conceding that something abusive had happened, while asking the jury for mercy rather than a death sentence. The jury was never told about Nikki's chronic pneumonia. They were never told about the dangerous medication she had been prescribed in the days before her death. CT scans of her head, taken in the weeks before her death, were never presented. In fact, those scans would not surface again for 15 years. They were eventually found misplaced in a courthouse basement. The jury convicted Robert Roberson of capital murder. He was sentenced to death. In the 2 decades since Roberson's conviction, the scientific consensus around shaken baby syndrome has shifted dramatically, though it remains a genuinely contested area of medicine, and it's important to say clearly, this is not settled science on either side. What has changed is this. Doctors and researchers now widely recognize that the specific combination of symptoms once treated as conclusive proof of violent shaking, bleeding in the brain, bleeding in the eyes, brain swelling, can also be caused by a range of other conditions. Severe infections, blood clotting disorders, certain genetic conditions, lack of oxygen from illnesses like pneumonia, even short falls in a child whose body is already compromised by illness can in rare circumstances produce similar findings. According to the National Registry of Exonerations, at least 41 people in the United States have now been exonerated after being wrongfully convicted based on the shaken baby hypothesis. In Robert Roberson's specific case, a team of independent medical experts, pathologists, toxicologists, radiologists, reviewed Nikki's full medical history after his conviction. Their conclusions were extraordinary. They found that Nikki had undiagnosed pneumonia, both viral and bacterial, in the days before her death. This pneumonia had progressed to sepsis, then septic shock, a condition where the body's organs begin shutting down in response to overwhelming infection. They found that the medications doctors had prescribed her days earlier, particularly promethazine, were respiratory suppressants, drugs that should never be given to a small child already struggling to breathe. Experts now believe this medication likely worsened her condition and hastened her decline. They identified a blood clotting disorder called DIC, disseminated intravascular coagulation, commonly triggered by severe infection, which causes exactly the kind of unexplained bruising and bleeding that was used as evidence of abuse at Roberson's trial. And those long-lost CT scans, finally found in 2018, when reviewed by a pediatric radiology expert, they showed only a single impact site on Nikki's head, consistent, the expert said, with Roberson's account that she had fallen out of bed. 10 independent forensic pathologists later issued a joint statement. Their conclusion, the original 2002 autopsy, was not reliable because the medical examiner never reviewed Nikki's medical records before declaring her death a homicide. Even Brian Wharton, the detective who arrested Robert Roberson and who testified for the prosecution at his trial, changed his mind. Wharton has since said in his own words that he came to believe Nikki died of accidental and natural causes, that there was no crime. He said he had fallen victim to confirmation bias. He saw what he expected to see in a moment of chaos, in a hospital, looking at a man whose reaction he misread because he didn't understand his autism. Wharton is now a minister. He visits Robert Roberson in prison. He has become an outspoken opponent of the death penalty, saying simply that human beings are too fallible to be trusted with a punishment that cannot be undone. It's important, in a case this serious, to say clearly, not everyone agrees. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton has firmly opposed every attempt to overturn Roberson's conviction. His office maintains that the original autopsy findings show Nikki suffered extensive head injuries inconsistent with a short fall or a viral illness. Paxton has pointed to allegations made by some family members, though without contemporaneous medical or police records to support them, that Roberson had a history of violence toward Nikki and other family members. The American Academy of Pediatrics, the leading professional body for child medicine in the United States, also continues to stand by the underlying diagnosis, now generally referred to as abusive head trauma, as a real and devastating injury, well documented in scientific literature, that does happen to children. This is genuinely contested terrain. The disagreement isn't between people who believe shaking a baby is acceptable and people who don't. Everyone agrees it is never acceptable. The disagreement is about whether the specific symptoms in this specific case can be reliably and exclusively attributed to abuse 2 decades after the fact, when so much of the original medical picture was incomplete. What can be said with more confidence is this: the jury that convicted Robert Roberson in 2003 never heard most of what you've just heard. Not the pneumonia, not the medication, not the CT scans, not the autism. Whatever the truth turns out to be, it was decided the first time, with most of the evidence missing. For years, Roberson's appeals moved through the courts and were repeatedly denied. By 2024, every conventional legal avenue had been exhausted. Texas set an execution date, October 17, 2024. What happened next was almost unprecedented. A bipartisan group of Texas state lawmakers, Republicans and Democrats together, took an extraordinary step. They issued a legislative subpoena, compelling Roberson to testify before a House committee about flaws in his conviction. Because a subpoena legally required his presence, it created a direct conflict with the execution order. The maneuver worked. Roberson's death warrant expired at midnight, less than 2 hours before he was set to be executed. He was, by every account, minutes away from the death chamber. The reprieve bought time, but not safety. In 2025, Texas set a new execution date, October 16, 2025. This time, the intervention came from the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals itself, the state's highest criminal court. 1 week before the scheduled execution, the court issued a stay citing its own ruling in a separate, strikingly similar case, that of Andrew Rourke, a Dallas County man convicted under the same discredited shaken baby framework, using the same expert witnesses. The court had already granted Rourke a new trial. The Dallas County District Attorney had then formally exonerated him. The court sent Roberson's case back to the trial court in Anderson County to determine whether the same relief should apply to him. Robert Roberson's case has now drawn attention far beyond Texas. More than 200,000 people have signed petitions calling for his execution to be halted. 34 scientists and physicians have submitted statements questioning the medical basis of his conviction. Autism advocacy organizations have weighed in, pointing to the role his undiagnosed condition played in how he was perceived by investigators and jurors. A Dateline NBC podcast investigation surfaced additional questions about the fairness of his original trial. And in September 2025, best-selling novelist John Grisham announced that his next book would not be fiction. It is called Shaken: The Rush to Execute an Innocent Man, and it focuses entirely on Robert Roberson's case. Grisham wrote, "The wrongful conviction of Robert Roberson has been an ongoing tragedy for over 20 years. If it now becomes a wrongful execution, it will live in infamy." The book is scheduled for publication in June 2026. As of today, Robert Roberson remains on death row in Texas, at the Polunsky unit. No new execution date has been set. His case has been sent back to the Anderson County District Court, where his legal team is fighting for a full evidentiary hearing, a chance to present the mountain of new medical evidence in open court, with live testimony from the experts who now believe Nikki Curtis died of natural causes. The state of Texas, through the Attorney General's office, continues to oppose this, arguing that procedural steps must be completed first. As recently as early 2026, the two sides were still disputing basic scheduling questions. How many witnesses? How much preparation time? When a hearing might even take place. Robert Roberson, now in his late 50s, has spent more than 2 decades waiting for a court to simply look, fully, fairly, in one place, at everything that has emerged since his trial. He has said in interviews from death row that he is not afraid to die, but that he is not ready to die. Not for something he didn't do. Whether he ultimately gets the new trial his lawyers are fighting for, whether Texas sets a third execution date, or whether this case becomes the moment America executes someone for a diagnosis, many scientists no longer fully trust. Nobody watching this video right now can say for certain. That is, in many ways, the most unsettling part of this entire story. It isn't finished yet. Robert Roberson's case forces an uncomfortable question that has nothing to do with whether you support or oppose the death penalty in general. It is simply this. In a system that allows no correction once a sentence is carried out, how much certainty is enough? For 2 decades, Texas has answered that question one way. For 2 decades, Robert Roberson and a growing number of scientists, lawmakers, and the very detective who arrested him have answered it another. This case is not over. When it ends, we will be there to tell you how.